You tell me that your baby make a fool of you. You tell me that he even tried to make it.
The 1960s was an era of musical revolution, but today, hardly anyone talks about them. Why did they disappear? Was it bad luck, industry politics, or something darker? Stay with me, because when we get to number 1, you'll see why even the most groundbreaking artists weren't safe. 20. Fred Neil.
I've been searching for the loving.
What if I told you the greatest folk song ever recorded almost never happened, and that its creator completely vanished afterward? Fred Neil was different from most musicians. He never chased fame. In fact, fame seemed to chase him. But here's what's wild. Fred wrote Everybody's Talkin', famously covered by Harry Nilsson for the iconic film Midnight Cowboy. This song won a Grammy and became the soundtrack to an entire generation, yet Fred himself barely registered on the public's radar. How could someone create such an influential piece and then simply disappear? Well, Fred hated the spotlight. He actively avoided interviews and even refused appearances on major TV shows. Friends described him as painfully shy, preferring late-night jam sessions to big concerts. However, Fred's personal life was equally fascinating. He abandoned New York's bustling music scene to quietly live in the Florida Keys, devoting himself entirely to saving dolphins. Yes, dolphins. He became so passionate that he founded a sanctuary for their protection. Many wondered if Fred regretted turning his back on music, but he never expressed any remorse. Music gave me anxiety, he once admitted. I'd rather live peacefully with nature than struggle with fame. Even Bob Dylan was fascinated by Fred, often attending his secretive gigs. Dylan later confessed Fred was one of the greatest songwriters ever, yet Fred stayed hidden until his passing. Imagine influencing Bob Dylan, yet choosing dolphins over music. Fred Neil truly lived life on his own remarkable terms. 19. The Mojo Men.
Sit down, I think I love you. Anywhere I
What if your band was topping charts, dominating radio airwaves, and then overnight you completely vanished without explanation? That's exactly what happened to the Mojo Men. In 1967, they exploded onto the scene with their smash hit, Sit Down, I Think I Love You, originally penned by Buffalo Springfield's Stephen Stills. Critics praised their smooth harmonies, fans adored their catchy melodies, and overnight, the Mojo Men seemed destined for greatness. But something strange happened. Instead of capitalizing on their newfound success, the group abruptly fell apart. Rumors swirled about internal disputes, label sabotage, and clashing egos. Some fans claimed record executives deliberately derailed their career to boost competing acts. However, the truth was even more bizarre. The band simply couldn't agree on their direction. Drummer Jan Erico later confessed, "We were young and overwhelmed. Suddenly, everyone wanted a say in our music." The band's constant fighting over artistic control quickly led to their collapse. Yet, despite this behind-the-scenes chaos, their music stayed influential. Many modern bands cite their songs as major inspirations, but ask the average listener today about the Mojo Men and they'll probably stare blankly. Even stranger, their hit song was rediscovered decades later in a commercial for shampoo, sparking a brief revival. Ironically, millions heard their music without knowing who they were. So imagine having a second shot at fame decades later and still remaining anonymous. The Mojo Men's career ended exactly as mysteriously as it began. 18. Bobby Fuller.
Breaking rocks in the hot sun. I fought the law and the law.
What if the rock anthem I Fought the Law was overshadowed by the mysterious death of the man who made it famous? Bobby Fuller was the perfect rock star for the 60s. Young, charismatic, and insanely talented. His band, the Bobby Fuller Four, exploded onto the scene in 1966 with their electrifying cover of I Fought the Law. Almost overnight, Fuller became one of rock music's brightest rising stars. But just when it seemed he was destined for greatness, something shocking happened. In July 1966, Bobby Fuller was found dead in his car, parked outside his Hollywood apartment. The circumstances were disturbing. His body was covered in gasoline and bruises marked his face and chest. Strangely, the authorities quickly labeled it a suicide, a verdict that baffled friends, family, and fans alike. His brother Randy Fuller immediately cried foul, claiming Bobby had no reason to harm himself. Rumors erupted. Was it murder? Was he targeted by mobsters involved in shady record label deals? However, even stranger theories emerged. Some whispered he'd angered music industry executives by refusing to compromise on creative decisions. Others hinted at jealousy among rival musicians. Years later, former manager Bob Keane suggested organized crime connections in the music industry played a role, hinting Bobby's tragic end was anything but accidental. Yet, despite the controversy and countless theories, Bobby Fuller's death remains unsolved to this day. His tragic and mysterious passing not only ended his career, but ensured that his music legacy would always be overshadowed by the chilling mystery of his final hours. 17. Clear Light.
Day crawls in, night's passed out, finds dear sleeping.
Imagine a band praised alongside the Doors, ready to dominate rock history, but instead disappearing completely without explanation. Clear Light entered the music scene in 1967, perfectly capturing the wild psychedelic energy sweeping America. Their self-titled debut album immediately drew attention from critics who called them the next big thing in rock. The album was intense, experimental, and brilliantly chaotic. Clear Light seemed destined for legendary status, yet, inexplicably, they vanished just as quickly as they arrived. What went wrong? The answer is complex but fascinating. Clear Light was assembled by their record label with ambitions to rival bands like Jefferson Airplane and The Doors, but this artificially created environment backfired spectacularly. Band members fought constantly, disagreeing on musical direction and struggling under label pressure. Lead vocalist Cliff DeYoung later confessed, "We barely knew each other. We were musicians thrown together like actors cast for a film." Tensions reached a breaking point during their first major tour, resulting in wild onstage fights. One infamous show ended with the drummer storming off mid-performance, never returning. However, despite the dysfunction, their music had already left a mark. Legendary Doors frontman Jim Morrison himself praised their sound, calling Clear Light one of the most interesting bands around. Today, their album is considered a hidden gem, a psychedelic masterpiece that captures the chaotic brilliance of late 60s rock. But tragically, due to label mismanagement and internal chaos, Clear Light remains mostly forgotten, a promising band forever overshadowed by their own potential. 16. Dino Valente.
You tell me that your baby make a fool of you. You tell me that he even tried to make you.
What if I told you the man behind one of the greatest peace anthems ever spent most of his career behind bars? Dino Valente, frontman and songwriter for the psychedelic rock band Quicksilver Messenger Service, was one of the 1960s most intriguing figures. Valente wrote the timeless peace anthem Get Together, famously performed by the Youngbloods. But here's the twist. While the song echoed peace, Valente's life was anything but peaceful. Just as Quicksilver Messenger Service was beginning to take off in San Francisco's thriving music scene, Valente was arrested for marijuana possession. Today this might seem minor, but back in 1965, it was career-ending. Sentenced to prison, Valente watched from behind bars as the band he founded soared without him. Friends said prison changed Valente drastically. He emerged bitter and frustrated, desperate to regain control over his band. Upon his release, he rejoined Quicksilver, but conflicts erupted almost immediately. Bandmates resented his attempts to dominate songwriting and performances. Tensions escalated until finally, Valente left again, this time voluntarily. However, despite personal troubles, Dino's songwriting continued to shape the music of the era. Countless artists admired his poetic lyrics, but Valente himself never recaptured the spotlight. Decades later, bandmate Gary Duncan admitted, "Dino was our biggest talent, but his timing was terrible. Trouble always seemed to find him." Today, Valente's legacy remains obscure, despite creating one of the most beloved anthems of the 60s. The irony? Most people singing Get Together don't even know the complicated life behind the peaceful lyrics they cherish. 15. Judy Henske.
I can't wait in the water.
Imagine being called Queen of the Beatniks, admired by Bob Dylan himself, yet becoming a forgotten name today. Judy Henske was a force of nature, combining folk, jazz, and blues into a sound unlike anyone else. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with a commanding stage presence, she electrified audiences wherever she performed. Bob Dylan once described her voice as an incredible thunderstorm you couldn't look away from. However, despite her brilliance, the music industry struggled to define her and ultimately failed to promote her properly. In the early 60s, Judy performed regularly at famous clubs like the Troubadour and Whiskey A Go-Go, captivating packed crowds nightly. Her powerful voice and outspoken personality made her a counterculture icon. Yet record executives didn't understand her unique style. Was she folk, blues, jazz? They simply couldn't label her, and this uncertainty crippled her career. Frustrated, Judy gradually stepped back from the spotlight. But here's what's fascinating. Her influence persisted even without mainstream success. Janis Joplin famously cited Henske as her inspiration, openly admitting she tried to mimic Judy's powerful delivery. "She sang how I felt," Joplin confessed. "I wouldn't be here without Judy." Ironically, Judy's songs became underground classics, influencing countless musicians. Yet today, her legacy is almost invisible, overshadowed by those she inspired. How can someone who influenced the greatest rock voices ever end up nearly erased from history? Judy's story reveals the harsh truth. Talent alone never guaranteed fame, especially when you're ahead of your time. 14. The Left Banke.
And when I see the sign that points one way.
What if I told you that one of the most beautiful songs of the 1960s was created by a band nobody remembers today? The Left Banke pioneered Baroque pop, blending classical orchestration with rock, a sound that would later influence bands like the Beatles and the Beach Boys. Their song Walk Away Renee became a massive hit in 1966, and their follow-up, Pretty Ballerina, solidified their reputation. But despite their brilliance, the Left Banke fell apart almost immediately after their breakthrough. Why? Internal conflicts. Keyboardist Michael Brown, who composed most of their songs, fell out with the rest of the band. He left before they could capitalize on their early success, effectively dooming the group. To make things worse, the record label fumbled their promotion, and within just a couple of years, they faded from the charts. Yet their impact never truly disappeared. Artists like Elliott Smith and Bell and Sebastian cite them as major influences. Even Steven Tyler of Aerosmith once admitted to sneaking into their recording sessions as a teenager, mesmerized by their unique sound. Imagine pioneering an entire subgenre of rock, influencing legendary musicians, and still ending up forgotten. That's the fate of the Left Banke, one of the most brilliant bands that history unfairly erased. 13. The Peanut Butter Conspiracy.
Back in LA, yeah, there's good reason for leaving here.
Imagine having everything, a perfect psychedelic sound, a loyal fan base, and the potential to be the next Jefferson Airplane, only to disappear completely. The Peanut Butter Conspiracy had all the ingredients for success. They emerged from the vibrant Los Angeles psychedelic rock scene, blending rich harmonies with mind-bending instrumentation. Their debut album, The Peanut Butter Conspiracy is Spreading, was filled with swirling, hallucinatory tracks that captured the era's experimental energy. However, timing wasn't on their side. They debuted just as the Summer of Love peaked, competing against a flood of other psychedelic bands. While Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead soared, the Peanut Butter Conspiracy struggled to get proper promotion. Their record label mismanaged them, releasing albums with little marketing support. But here's the crazy part. Legendary producer Gary Usher, who worked with the Byrds and the Beach Boys, believed they had the potential to be one of the biggest bands of the decade. He pushed them to evolve, but the music industry's ruthless nature left them behind. By the 1970s, they had disbanded, becoming a footnote in psychedelic history. Today, their albums are rare collector's items, but few people remember their name. A tragic ending for a band that once seemed destined for greatness. 12. Arthur Lee, Love. What if one of the greatest albums of all time was created by a band that history decided to ignore? Arthur Lee, the mastermind behind the band Love, was one of the most innovative artists of the 1960s. His 1967 masterpiece, Forever Changes, was a psychedelic rock album so ahead of its time that critics didn't know what to do with it. Today, it's ranked among the greatest albums ever made, often listed alongside the Beatles and the Beach Boys. But unlike them, Arthur Lee and Love never achieved mainstream fame. Why? Lee had an unpredictable, rebellious personality. He refused to tour extensively, distrusted record executives, and clashed with his bandmates. While bands like The Doors, who once opened for Love, rose to legendary status, Love faded into obscurity. Even when Forever Changes was later recognized as a classic, it was too late. Lee spent years in and out of legal trouble, even serving time in prison. By the time he was released, a new generation of musicians, including Johnny Marr of the Smiths, hailed him as a genius. But Love never reclaimed its place in the mainstream. Arthur Lee's story is a cautionary tale. Sometimes raw talent and innovation aren't enough if the industry doesn't know what to do with you. 11. The Blues Project.
You can call me from a snow-white starlit.
Imagine influencing the very foundation of blues rock, only to have your name erased from history. The Blues Project was a pioneering group in the mid-1960s, blending blues, rock, jazz, and folk in a way that no one had done before. Without them, the blues-influenced rock explosion of the late 60s, Led Zeppelin, Cream, and the Allman Brothers, might not have happened the same way. But unlike those legendary bands, the Blues Project never got their moment in the spotlight. Why? They were too early. Their fusion of blues and rock came before the genre exploded into mainstream success, and by the time it did, the band had already splintered. Another reason? They were overshadowed by the very artists they inspired. While bands like the Rolling Stones and Eric Clapton's Cream carried blues rock into superstardom, the Blues Project remained a niche name among hardcore music fans. However, their influence didn't go unnoticed by musicians. In fact, Carlos Santana once credited them with inspiring his unique sound. But despite their impact, today they're rarely mentioned in the conversation about the 1960s rock revolution. They were pioneers, but as history has shown, pioneers often get left behind while others walk the road they built. 10. Tim Buckley.
Long afloat on shiftless oceans.
What if an artist pushed the limits of music so far that even the industry couldn't keep up with him? Tim Buckley wasn't just a folk musician, he was an experimenter, constantly reshaping his sound. While most artists stuck to a formula, Buckley refused to be predictable. His voice could soar into an almost operatic range, and his music blended folk, jazz, and avant-garde elements like no one else. Critics adored him, but mainstream audiences found his style too unconventional. At first, he showed commercial promise with albums like Goodbye and Hello, 1967, but he quickly abandoned folk for more complex improvisational work. As a result, his later records became cult classics rather than mainstream hits. Record labels grew frustrated, and his commercial appeal faded. But here's the twist. Many now consider Buckley a genius. Tragically, his life was cut short at 28 due to a heroin overdose. Even worse, his legacy was overshadowed by his son Jeff Buckley, who would later rise to fame with grace. Today, Jeff's name is widely known, while Tim remains a cult fascination. Ironically, Tim Buckley's refusal to conform made him legendary only after his death. The industry couldn't handle him, but music history refuses to forget him. 9. The Electric Prunes.
Last night your shadow fell upon my lonely room.
What if a band created one of the most mind-bending psychedelic albums ever, but lost control of their own music? The Electric Prunes were pioneers of psychedelic rock, best known for their trippy 1966 hit, I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night. Their fuzzy guitars and eerie sound perfectly capture the psychedelic movement. But what makes their story even wilder is what happened after their success. They had a groundbreaking producer, David Axelrod, who pushed them to experiment. However, this quickly turned into a nightmare. Axelrod took full creative control, and by their later albums, the Electric Prunes were barely involved in their own music. Studio musicians replaced band members, and their sound became unrecognizable. The final blow? Their name was sold off. Yes, an entirely different set of musicians became the Electric Prunes without the original members. The band had been erased while their name lived on. Despite this bizarre fate, their music influenced artists like the Flaming Lips and My Bloody Valentine. Many modern bands still cite them as an inspiration for experimental rock. Imagine creating something revolutionary only to watch someone else take your name and run with it. That's the strange, tragic, and fascinating fate of the Electric Prunes. 8. Gene Clark, The Byrds.
I have to let you go, and right away.
What if one of the greatest songwriters of the 1960s helped shape an entire genre only to be forgotten by the world? Gene Clark was the creative powerhouse behind the Byrds, penning some of their most iconic songs, including I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better and 8 Miles High. His deep, introspective lyrics and smooth melodies made him one of the first true folk rock pioneers. Yet, despite his genius, his name remains a footnote in rock history. Why? Clark made a critical mistake. He left the Byrds too soon. At the peak of their success, he walked away, reportedly due to a mix of stage fright and conflicts with the band. Without him, the Byrds continued to thrive, while Clark's solo career struggled. He released several brilliant albums, including No Other, 1974, now considered a masterpiece. But at the time, it flopped commercially, and record labels abandoned him. Even worse, Clark battled personal demons. Substance abuse and self-doubt haunted his later years. By the time music historians rediscovered his work, it was too late. Clark passed away in 1991. Today, his albums are celebrated among collectors and critics, but the mainstream music world barely knows his name. Imagine creating some of the best songs in rock history and still being forgotten. That's Gene Clark's heartbreaking legacy. 7. Spanky and Our Gang.
Blue sky, sunshine, what a day to take a walk.
What if a band with chart-topping hits disappeared simply because their sound didn't fit the changing times? Spanky and Our Gang were a folk pop powerhouse in the mid-1960s, known for their lush harmonies and feel-good hits like Sunday Will Never Be the Same and Lazy Day. They had the formula for success: catchy melodies, incredible vocal arrangements, and a dedicated fan base. But despite their rise, they faded into obscurity faster than anyone expected. The reason? They were victims of a musical revolution. By the late 60s, rock was shifting towards heavier, more experimental sounds. Groups like the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and Jimi Hendrix dominated the charts, while folk pop bands like Spanky and Our Gang were seen as too soft. To make matters worse, tragedy struck. Malcolm Hale, the band's lead guitarist and arranger, died suddenly in 1968 due to carbon monoxide poisoning. The loss devastated the group, and without his leadership, they struggled to recover. By 1969, Spanky and Our Gang had officially disbanded. Their songs are still played on oldies radio stations, but their name rarely comes up in conversations about the 1960s greatest bands. They had the talent, they had the hits, but history simply moved on without them. 6. The Chambers Brothers.
Time has come today. Young hearts can go their way.
What if one of the most electrifying soul rock bands of the 1960s had the perfect song for their time, only to disappear just as fast as they rose? The Chambers Brothers were trailblazers, blending gospel, soul, and psychedelic rock into something completely unique. Their 1968 hit, Time Has Come Today, was revolutionary. A hypnotic, nearly 11-minute epic filled with distorted guitars, echoing vocals, and an energy that perfectly captured the chaotic late 60s. It was unlike anything in soul music at the time. But despite their success, they never reached the level of fame their talent deserved. One major reason? The industry wasn't ready for them. As an all-black band fusing soul with rock, they struggled to fit into a category. Record labels didn't know how to market them. Black stations thought they were too rock, and rock stations thought they were too soul. Additionally, by the 1970s, the music scene was changing. The psychedelic era was over, and funk and disco were taking over the charts. The Chambers Brothers tried to adapt, but failed to maintain their momentum. Today, Time Has Come Today is still celebrated, often used in movies and commercials, but the band itself remains criminally underrated. They helped shape the future of rock and soul, yet most people barely remember their name. 5. Phil Ochs.
Oh, I marched to the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the earth.
What if a musician rivaled Bob Dylan as one of the most powerful voices of protest music, only to be forgotten in history? Phil Ochs wasn't just a folk singer, he was a fierce activist, writing some of the most politically charged songs of the 1960s. Tracks like I Ain't Marching Anymore and There But For Fortune became anthems for the anti-war movement. Unlike Dylan, who often wrote in poetic metaphors, Ochs was direct, unfiltered, and unapologetically political. But that same intensity became his downfall. As the Vietnam War ended and protest movements declined, Ochs struggled to adapt his message. Folk music was no longer leading the charts, and his songs became harder to sell. Record labels turned their backs on him, and his audience shrank. Even worse, Ochs battled severe depression and alcoholism. His career spiraled downward, and in 1976, he tragically took his own life at just 35 years old. Many believe that if he had lived longer, he might have been rediscovered, much like Dylan and other folk legends. Today, only hardcore folk fans remember Phil Ochs, but in the 60s, he was one of the most important voices of an era, a voice that history unfairly silenced too soon. 4. David Ackles.
When the farm hands come around and she sows all the...
What if an artist was so ahead of his time that even the music industry didn't know what to do with him? David Ackles was a singer-songwriter unlike any other in the late 60s. His music wasn't rock, folk, or pop. It was theatrical, cinematic, and deeply poetic. Think of a cross between Leonard Cohen, Tom Waits, and Broadway musicals, and you might come close to understanding his style. His 1968 self-titled debut and the 1972 masterpiece American Gothic were filled with haunting orchestral arrangements and dark storytelling lyrics that painted vivid pictures of American life. Critics hailed him as a genius, and even Elton John once called American Gothic one of the greatest albums ever made. So why is he forgotten? Because he didn't fit anywhere. The music industry had no idea how to market him. He wasn't folk enough for folk fans, not rock enough for rock fans, and not commercial enough for radio. As a result, his albums never sold well, and he faded into obscurity. Despite his lack of success, Ackles influenced future legends. Elvis Costello once said, "If there's a musician I wish more people knew about, it's David Ackles." Unfortunately, he never lived to see his music appreciated. He passed away in 1999, still a mystery to most. 3. The Beau Brummels.
I hate to say it, but I told you so. Don't mind my preaching to you.
What if I told you that one of the first American bands to rival the British invasion was erased from history? The Beau Brummels were pioneers of folk rock, blending British-style melodies with American storytelling years before the Byrds made it famous. Their hits, Laugh Laugh and Just a Little, were early 60s classics, helping shape what would become the folk rock movement. In fact, their sound was so similar to the Beatles that many listeners assumed they were British. But despite their influence, they vanished. Why? Their record label, Autumn Records, collapsed just as they were gaining momentum. Then Warner Brothers signed them, not to push their folk rock sound, but to force them into making a country album. It was a disaster. Fans were confused, and sales plummeted. By the late 60s, the band had fallen apart. Their lead singer, Sal Valentino, had one of the most distinctive voices of the era, but even he couldn't keep them afloat. Today, music historians recognize the Beau Brummels as one of the first great American rock bands, but the general public has no idea who they are. If the music industry had handled them better, they might have been America's answer to the Beatles. Instead, they're a forgotten footnote in rock history. 2. The Seeds.
Pushing too hard, you're pushing on me. You're pushing too hard, what you want me to be.
What if one of the most influential garage rock bands in history set the stage for punk, only to be nearly forgotten? The Seeds were pioneers of raw, gritty, and rebellious rock music. Their 1965 hit, Pushin' Too Hard, became an anthem for youthful defiance, and their aggressive, fuzzed-out sound influenced punk rock years before punk even existed. Frontman Sky Saxon had an unpredictable energy that made their live shows legendary. Bands like the Ramones and the Stooges owe a debt to the Seeds for breaking ground in stripped-down, attitude-driven rock. So why did they disappear? They were too ahead of their time. While the Beatles and the Rolling Stones polished their sound for mainstream appeal, the Seeds stayed rough and unfiltered. The music industry didn't know how to market them. By the late 1960s, when psychedelia was evolving, the Seeds couldn't adapt. Their later albums drifted into experimental territory, losing the raw energy that made them special. Sky Saxon tried reviving the band multiple times, but the Seeds never regained their early momentum. Today they're cult legends, beloved by musicians but unknown to mainstream audiences. Without the Seeds, punk rock might have never happened the way it did. Yet their place in music history remains unfairly overlooked. 1. Moby Grape.
Dawn a lifetime, the birds sing.
What if a band had everything? Talent, critical acclaim, and industry hype, yet still became one of the greatest lost legends in rock history? Moby Grape was poised to be the biggest band of the psychedelic era. They had it all. 5 insanely talented musicians, tight harmonies, and a style that blended rock, folk, blues, and jazz effortlessly. Their 1967 debut album, Moby Grape, was a masterpiece. Critics called it one of the greatest rock albums ever made. But what happened next destroyed them. Columbia Records made a fatal mistake. They released 5 singles on the same day, confusing radio stations and splitting their own momentum. To make things worse, a legal battle over their name prevented them from recording under Moby Grape for years. Then came the personal tragedies. Their guitarist, Skip Spence, suffered a mental breakdown, allegedly attacking a bandmate with an axe while on an LSD trip. He was institutionalized and the band never fully recovered. By the time they tried a comeback, the moment had passed. Other San Francisco bands, Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, became legends, while Moby Grape faded into obscurity. Today, their debut album remains a hidden treasure, but the band itself? Lost to time. They should have been legends, but instead, they became rock's greatest what if. Enjoyed this dive into music's forgotten legends? Smash that like button and subscribe now. Don't miss out. Click here to explore more incredible stories hidden in history. Trust me, the best is yet to come. See you in the next video.